Hello everyone. Thank you for such a wonderful response to this extremely important, I think, politically, culturally, in every way important event. Welcome to welcome to cultural resistance during dark times. A discussion with Anand Patwardhan. Now, a few words about Anand. So, I would say I think of Anand as a sort of quintessential activist documentary filmmaker. Anand was educated, interestingly, in Mumbai and in the United States at Brandeis University, but also at Montreal's McGill University. He's been making documentaries since the early 1970s, and his latest, Vivek, which is a searing look at the way in which so many secularist and rationalist intellectuals and activists have been murdered by people who, by all accounts, seem to be close to Hindutva. His films range over a number of a very wide range of topics, including workers' rights, nationalism, the plight of Dalits in India, nuclear nationalism, etc. And of course, the rise of Hindu nationalism in India has been a major theme. And Ram Ke Naam, which was really, I think, which came out in the early 1990s, with Ram Ke Naam, Anand was there from the beginning, documenting what Hindutva has done to India. He has an amazing way of finding the right and most interesting people to talk to work with them to bring out what I think is the essence of the issues, and often to capture the most outrageous claims being made in a completely blasé fashion, straight from the horse's mouth. So these qualities have, of course, made his films very hard-hitting. It's hard to think of a documentary filmmaker whose films are watched with almost as much enthusiasm, perhaps as much enthusiasm as feature films. And therefore, of course, he's had many run-ins with governments, particularly BJP governments, that have tried to censor him. And of course, his films have won dozens, literally dozens of prizes across the world at film festivals and elsewhere. And Anand is also a member of the prestigious Academy of Motion Pictures. So with this introduction, let me just open up our discussion, our hour or so of discussion with Anand, to which I'm looking forward very much. So over to you, Dipti.
Thank you, Dr. Desai. Thank you so much, Anand, for waking up this early to be with us. And I will dive right into the questions, and I want to make the most of the time we have with you. We will begin this discussion with Ram Ke Naam, as our audience today has watched the film and they will be joining us in this space also eventually. The film opens with a man on a motorcycle stating very confidently, Ram Mandir will definitely be made. This past year, we saw the Sthapna, or the laying of the foundation of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya. Almost 29 years later, the temple will now be built in 36 months. Your film in 1992 seems to be foreshadowing this. What are your thoughts on this today?
And just a minor correction. My film was actually shot in 1990.
Okay, sorry.
It was completed in 1991, which means it was made before the demolition of the Babri Mosque. It was meant as a warning to the country of what would happen if religious fundamentalism wasn't checked. Because at that time, the first attack on the mosque took place, which I documented in 1990, October. And then the actual demolition happened in December 1992. I wasn't in Ayodhya at the time, but I added a postscript which became part of Ram Ke Naam. So Ram Ke Naam is shot up to 1990, but a postscript was added after the mosque was demolished in 92. And then when Pujari Lal Das, who was the main protagonist in Ram Ke Naam, the Hindu priest who speaks against the destruction of the mosque, because he says that we're already praying here. The Hindu worshippers are already praying inside this compound, and there's no need to change the status quo. And the people who are trying to change it are those who have nothing to do even with religion. They never even came to pray here. He was referring to the Vishwa Hindu Parishad that had spearheaded the attack on the mosque. So that was 1990, and then 92 afterwards. We kept trying to show the film. After we had to clear the censor board hurdle. It took some time, but even after getting the censor certificate without any cuts, there was no easy way to show it, and we kept fighting for it to be shown on Doordarshan, the national television channel of the time, which still is the national television channel in India, except that in 1990, Doordarshan was almost the only TV in India. All the other channels hadn't arrived yet or were just beginning. So the maximum viewership in the country watched Doordarshan, which is why we wanted to get it on national TV. We finally won a court case in '96, and then the film was shown on Doordarshan. But by that time, the mosque had been demolished 4 years ago. What was on TV, and we're talking about a not a BJP government. In 1990, it was a so-called secular government of the Congress, and then, while we were fighting to get Ki Naam on TV, there were many governments came and went. None of them supported the screening of Ki Naam on TV. So that's why we had to go to the court route. But what in 1990 was happening on TV was that the Ramayan serial was being broadcast every single Sunday. Everyone dropped all other work to go and watch the Ramayan TV. And this is the prelude to the whole Babri Masjid demolition movement, because it came on the back of a running serial that the government was showing at prime time every single Sunday, which went on for almost a year, or maybe even longer than a year. Right. So the government of the day, which was meant to be secular, was promoting this kind of mythology, thinking it was very innocent, just cultural stuff that it was showing. But it created the atmosphere in which a huge national Ram temple movement grew.
So, I mean, the temple is going to be built in 36 months now. So, I mean, this is in some ways what the situation in India is right now is worse, far, far worse than what it was at that given time when you were shooting it too.
I would also say that really, I have no objection to temples being built.
Absolutely.
I mean, if there are people who are religious and they want a temple, they can have a temple. But this was not about the building of a temple. This was not about any religion. This was calculated to create the tensions that they wanted in order to come to power. Before the Ram Temple, Ram Janmabhoomi, Babri Masjid conflict, the BJP had only 2 seats in parliament. And it was through this movement that the number of seats increased to 88. And then finally they came to power, and they're in power right now. So it was almost like a single issue that brought a party that was obscure into power. And this is a party that came from an ideology that was hated in India at the time of independence, or soon after independence, because they are the ones who, their ideology killed Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi was killed by people who belonged to RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, elite that belonged to, elite I don't mean in class terms necessarily, but they were elite in terms of caste terms. And they made the conspiracy that killed Gandhi, and they are in power right now.
Is India a Hindu nation as the RSS sees it, or does it remain a secular, plural society? It was founded to be in the beginning as we chose it to be India and not Hindustan. And how and why cultural resistance is the last gatekeeper against total dictatorship?
Okay, so India is a secular country by definition, in the sense that it was defined at that. It's true that when we the first constitution we got, Dr. Ambedkar did not, I mean, and the group that wrote the constitution did not use the word secularism in that constitution, because they took secularism for granted. Everything, if you read the constitution, the secularism is embedded in the whole structure of the constitution. So they didn't actually use the word because they didn't feel it was necessary, because that whole freedom struggle was largely a secular movement. And so there was no question of, it sounded redundant to say secularism. But that word secularism and socialism were added during Indira Gandhi's time. And that is why the right-wing forces now object to the words secularism and socialism in the constitution, because they said it was added later. But it's there in our constitution. So by definition, we're a secular state. And And by the way, even Pakistan was meant to be a secular state when it was first created. Even the Pakistan constitution was secular uh, when Jinnah uh, led the partition movement. But then the Pakistan constitution also got changed and it became an Islamic state under Ziaul Haq. So these are tendencies. India has not yet declared that it's a Hindu state, but the parties that are in power, their junior members keep saying it in public that they're fighting for a Hindu nation. So they find it not embarrassing or not illegal to say that and to propagate it. I mean, some people do it by talking about it and some people do it quietly, but they are moving in that direction.
I mean, it is interesting. Today is the 25th of January for you. Tomorrow is going to be 71 years marking the Republic Day of India in India. So it's actually interesting that we are having this conversation today for several reasons also. Mary Haywood actually sent a question which kind of follows up our first question also, is that the voice of reason seems to be in the words of the Hindu Pujari Lal Das that you were mentioning also, who does not want the masjid to be demolished and pays dearly with his life, as well as in the words of the untouchable grain washerwoman. Was it a conscious choice for it not to be a moderate Muslim? Is this part of the message, if we all fight, then we all lose?
No, it was not a conscious choice. It was, but while editing, of course, everything is conscious. While shooting, I gather all the evidence that I can. But how I structure it, and the fact that I put the Hindu priest of the Ram temple as my main protagonist, who's actually saying the things that I more or less agree with, actually. Although I'm not religious myself. But I have no objection to people who are religious but don't use their religion to attack somebody else, who are inclusive in their ideas. Pujari Lal Das was one such person who he was the government appointed priest of the Ram Janmabhoomi temple. If you recall, Hindus and Muslims had lived in harmony, even prayed together within the Babri Masjid compound for a whole century. Because 1857, when the dispute began, there was a Hindu priest and a Muslim leader of the area, influential leader, who actually made a pact of harmony in 1857. Remember again that date is the same year that the War of Independence had begun, the first War of Independence, where Hindus and Muslims had united against the British and had almost thrown them out. They'd almost won the war against the British colonialism. And in order to fight that, every device was used to divide the Hindus and Muslims. And Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid was one such device that the British successfully exploited by spreading the story that Babur had demolished a Ram temple. Now, if you actually try to look at whether that is possible or not, firstly, I don't believe that there were Ram temples in Ayodhya in the 16th century. There were very few, because for the simple reason that the Ramayana was in Sanskrit, the Tulsidas Ramayana. Only the upper caste Brahmins had access to it. It was not a popular story that it became later after the Ramcharitra-manas, which was the Tulsidas Ramayana. So when the Tulsidas Ramayana came into being, which was in the 16th century, that is when Ram temples began to be built. So after the fact of the so-called demolition of that spot. So it's unlikely that what was demolished was a Ram temple, because for the simple reason that Ram was not a popular god in the 16th century, not yet. Only when it came into the Khadi Boli kind of Hindi, it became popularized after Tulsidas, who translated it and actually created almost a different kind of a Ramayana story, slightly. And many things, if you analyze the Ram that when I was growing up, that the image of Ram was always a Ram, was a very peaceful looking Ram with a smile on his face. And he was meant to be the Ram who was Maryada Purushottam, the, the king who looked after all his subjects, no matter what their differences were. And that was turned into the Ram with the bow and arrow. So the Ram that now is popular in India, the image of Ram has a bow and arrow. And this was something manufactured when this temple mosque movement began.
I'm actually thinking that this film actually talks about how the mosque is seen as a symbol of slavery,
Yeah.
and like even now, people, whenever we have these kind of conversations, they're constantly at the by several people now. Even like today, they have this whole notion that definitely this has to be replaced. This has to be somehow, the temple has to be put in place, it has to be reinstated. And yet we have no basis, as your film very clearly tells us. It's like there's no proof that that is where Ram was born also.
Yeah, so the level of mythology is multiple. The level of mythology starts with the birth of Ram. I mean, Ram is not a historical person. Ram is a part of mythology, of religion. And so to have a birthplace and an exact birth spot for Ram itself is illogical. And you see that in Ram Ki Naam when I asked the followers, the Ram Bhakts, about when was Ram born, they had no answer. They had no answer. They said Ram was born in Treta Yuga, which is before history began to be recorded. So they had they were not even within thousands of years of identifying the birth date of Ram. But they had the exact spot where he was born. So they knew exactly where he was born while not even coming within centuries or thousands of years of the date. So that's obviously it's obviously logically impossible. So when I say things like that, they counter with, but that's a matter of faith. I mean, how do you know that Jesus's mother was a virgin? I mean, how do Christians believe that that's a Virgin Mary? Mary is a virgin. I mean, that sounds illogical. So all these things are not scientific; they are part of faith. So okay, so if we're going to call it faith, I have no problem with it. If it's faith, you believe something, so you believe it. But you know that it's not a historical fact. So then after that, to turn that around into a historical claim of a property, that becomes problematic. And our court went so far as in the Allahabad High Court, they ruled that God himself was a litigant. So Ram Lalla, which means the baby Ram, was an actual litigant in the court case. So the court, one of the judges ruled that, this is Ram's property. Ram is baby Ram has appointed a lawyer who's fighting this case. So that is the level of absurdity that we're in, where gods come on earth and fight court cases. I mean, when gods come on earth and fight court cases, very little chance for people like me who also fight court cases. We can't fight and win against God. So yes, so the court case was decided in favor of God, and the court also later decided about the demolition of the mosque. I mean, there were two different court cases. One was about the property. Property was awarded, to the people who were the caretakers of God, appointed by God, and then there was a court case about the demolition itself. Who demolished the mosque and was that legal or not? Earlier, there was, all the evidence showed that the mosque was, it was demolished on camera. The cameras recorded the whole demolition. So there the court ruled that it was demolished by antisocial elements who were unknown. Now, they were right that they were antisocial elements, but they were certainly not unknown because they were on camera. And not only that, there were hundreds of interviews by the car sevaks who had done the demolition, who talked on camera, sometimes on hidden camera, because Anirudh Bahal and the people who run Cobra Post had done a sting operation on some of the people who were accused in that case. And many of them spoke on camera, talking about how even the first time that they attacked the Babri Mosque, which is the time that I was recording in 1990, and some car sevaks were killed by the police at that time. These people, the car sevaks on camera, later on admitted that they actually got them killed. If you can imagine the mindset that deliberately put their own working class people in the front of the demonstrations, firing lines, so that they would be killed, because they knew that once they get killed, they'll become martyrs, and then we can carry on the movement and build it further. So they deliberately got their own people killed in 1990. And this is on camera, this is on record. Yet, again, our memory history is very short. These kind of stories don't come into the mainstream and people don't know about it.
People are actually asking in the chat also that, could you respond why the mosque was associated with slavery also?
Yeah, so this has been a long exercise in manufacturing a certain ideas, and this is not just the Indian Hindutva historians that have created this. This was also the mischief played by the British historians. The British historians are partly responsible for propagating these kind of ideas. They propagated the idea that there were martial races in India, some who were very brave, and they were fighters, because the British were creating an army mainly of Indian people. The British ruled in India with hardly 6,000-7,000 Englishmen who were controlling the whole country, because they got their Indians to do their dirty work. They got Indians into their army. They divided their army into battalions from different communities. Then that's why they needed to float the idea of martial races, like the Rajputs were the Hindu martial races. They were Afghani soldiers. They were Sikhs battalions, there was Maratha battalions, there was a Mahar battalion, all of that. So that's how they did divide and rule. And many of those ideas remain with us today, because they were created for colonial rule, which was the divide and rule methodology. Sorry, I just wanted to get back to your question about this idea of slavery and the Mughals, what they did. Yes, it's a common mythology that is spread in India, is that the Muslims were very brutal. The Muslim rules, and they characterize Muslims as one entity, when actually over 1,000 years there were many different rulers, some of them Muslims, and they fought each other as well. There wasn't a consolidated Muslim rule as such, but there were people within those groups that were very different from each other. So even amongst the Mughals, there were people like Akbar was very different from Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb was very different from his own brother Dara Shikoh. So there were Muslim leaders who actually inculcated a kind of harmony within society, to some extent religious harmony. Akbar was one of them. And there were Muslim rulers who emphasized their own religion much more. But they are no different from any of the rulers of that era. The fact that they demolished our temples and subjugated women and things like that, that was true of all rulers. Whether when the Hindu kings captured some other king's territory, the first thing they would do was to go to the temples and destroy the temple, because the loot, all the riches were stored in the temples. So they didn't have banks in those days. They actually kept the stuff in gold and silver, and temples were one of the places. So it would be any conquering king would go and demolish a temple or whatever religious place there was at the time to get at that. So anyway, I'm not making excuses for what happened in the past. I'm saying it's not relevant to what is happening today. Yeah, and it also depends on how far back in history you want to go, because
Yeah.
If they want to go back to 500 years, and supposing their claim is right that there was a temple here before 500 years, which in fact I'm saying is not necessarily true, that there was a Ram temple. Most likely that's not the case. But even if that was the case, supposing somebody comes to my house today and says, sorry, you better get out because 500 years ago my ancestors owned this property. But now in independent India, I own this property, and you can't take it away from me saying that 500 years ago your people were born here. Because if you go back 500 years, then why can't you go back 2,000 years more, when this was a place probably where Adivasis prayed to a tree? So who has the claim on the land? It just depends on how far back in history you go. The earliest digs in Ayodhya, earliest archaeological digs, show that it was likely to have been a Buddhist site. So all these claims are very modern claims and very artificial claims, and calculated just to create tension and polarization.
The film focuses mostly on Hindu fundamentalists, less on Muslim fundamentalists.
In 1990, when I went to Ayodhya, that Hindu fundamentalism, the rise of Hindu fundamentalism was apparent in front of my eyes. And I believe that in India, we are, the Hindus are over an 80% majority. For an over 80% majority to think that they are insecure because of a 14% minority, Muslims post-partition are around 14%. So that is an absurdity. You're claiming that an 80% strong majority is so afraid of a 14% small minority that they have to do extraordinary things to survive. Actually, the reverse is true, that it is the minorities that are under attack, the minorities that have been not just physically threatened, but they've been kept in very poor conditions. If you look at every indice, you can see that Dalits amongst the Hindu society, the so-called or Buddhists or Adivasis on the one hand, and a Muslim minority on the other hand. These are very depressed sections of society. And so the claim that the majority is afraid of the minority is actually completely a manufactured claim.
How do you see the arts, in your case films particularly, as a most potent lens to critique, question, and reframe a modern Indian identity?
I believe that the struggle that is most likely to succeed is the movement that doesn't rely on weapons for their battles, but relies on ideas, relies on presenting a point of view that is compelling, that people, with facts that can be referred to and researched. And it's this that we are trying to create. We're trying to create a rational way of thinking that takes facts on board. And I think that can be best done through the arts, through genuine education. I'm not saying that the people who go to school and college necessarily get a genuine education in India today, because even our educational institutions have been communalized. We're taught alternate stories, alternate histories, and I think it's the job of people who actually have looked at many more sides of these issues and have studied more, should present their work so that others can have access to this. So in that sense, there needs to be a cultural revolution, because actually what we have done is that we have surrendered the space for culture to the right wing. The right wing has a ready-made cultural background. Right wing relies on those who rely on religion, have ready-made cultural icons. They have, through the centuries, so many gods and goddesses, so many holidays and festivals and everything that can be organized around these religious events creates huge material for cultural use. I mean, like the Ram story was carried through Ram Leelas long before cinema and television. I mean, when I talked about the Doordarshan's Ramayan, that was in 1990, but before that, there have been Ram Leelas in northern India, from village to village. And originally, the Ram Leelas were not necessarily bad things. They were part of the cultural outpourings, and they didn't necessarily create um, terrible kind of hatred within society. It was part of our culture, but then that became ready material for those who wanted to use religion for political gain, to use those same symbols in a different way, in a militant way. So now that whole cultural area is captured by the fundamentalist forces, we who are trying to fight fundamentalism and fight for a secular society, for humane society, we need to come up with our own iconography, our own symbols of resistance, and all these symbols are also there in our own history. It just depends on where you look. So if starting from the Buddha and Kabir and the whole Bhakti movement, and there are Guru Nanak, and there are people in every religion that have spoken about love and compassion. And that is something that we can build on. And I believe that's what Gandhiji tried to do. I mean, his idea of, he didn't speak about secularism in the Western sense or the French sense of secularism, where everything had to, this very strict division between state and church. But he talked about believing that all religions were saying the same thing, and that every religion had a right to exist. And so I fall somewhere in the middle. I think that is, as I said, perfectly fine for people to be religious, as long as that's what they're actually doing, having a personal communication with their God, which they do at home, and don't necessarily bring it on the street. And if they bring it on the street, even if they do that as a cultural expression genuinely, which is not full of hatred for another community, even that would be okay. So, but today we see the use of religion for the purpose of spreading hatred. And that is where we as a secular state must draw the line, that you can't do that.
What inspires or motivates a documentary filmmaker like yourself to focus on so many sensitive and yet necessary socio-political driven films?
No, I think that I come from a position of privilege, in the sense that I'm privileged by not only my religion, but my caste. I didn't have to make a living to survive. I could do whatever I wanted to do with my life. Also, being Hindu, being born so-called upper caste, gave me privileges that people take for granted because they don't think about caste. They don't realize that they're actually living a very privileged existence. So I saw it as my responsibility to use my privilege. I mean, let me put it this way, that if a Muslim had made the films that I make, they probably wouldn't live to tell the tale. There's a Muslim journalist from Kerala who is in jail in Uttar Pradesh because he went to report the rape in Hathras. The rape, UP has become the rape state of India. Every day is rape capital, yeah. And this journalist was going to do a report there, and he's in jail still. Cooked up charges against him, because once you're a Muslim, they can call you a terrorist, and they don't have to prove it. They can throw you in jail, and then 5 years later or whenever, the courts will find that you are not guilty, but your time has been wasted in jail. There have been many cases like that, people whom they could never prove guilty, but they kept them in jail for years. So there are many. There's now a stand-up comedian, Munawar Faruqi, who is in jail because they claim that he was going to insult a Hindu gods. That speech was never even delivered. So point is that, yeah, he's been in jail now for 25 days. Uh, there was a friend of ours who was part of Faisal Khan was part of a Padyatra in Mathura. By the way, just as there was a Ram temple movement that galvanized all these forces, they had already declared that, and you can hear it even in Ram Ke Naam, that Ram Mandir ek jhanki hai, Kashi Mathura baki hai. That is that after the Ram temple, they're going to switch to Mathura and Kashi, because they're looking for wherever they can make trouble, wherever there is some kind of a dispute between Hindus and Muslims over a particular site. And there may not be even a dispute today, right now, but there's some memory of some dispute that they can dig up and then build on. So Mathura is their target, one of the targets, because that's supposed to be now the birthplace of Krishna. So that gives them another opportunity to go and create polarization. So anyway, meanwhile, Faisal Khan had started in 2011, revived the movement of the Khudai Khidmatgars. Now, the Khudai Khidmatgars was the movement started by Badshah Khan, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, pre-independence, who was one of Gandhiji's most trusted followers in the Northwest region. And Badshah Khan and his followers, the Khudai Khidmatgars, which literally means the servants of God, were Pathans, mainly Pathans, who, in that region, there was a long history of blood feuds between the tribes and things like that. The revenge would be carried out from family to family over generations. But Badshah Khan converted this group of people into the bravest non-violent fighters of the independence movement. And they faced British bullets and Badshah Khan spent the most numbers of years in British jails than anyone else that I know. And then after independence, he got into trouble with the Pakistan authorities because he didn't believe in partition either. And he was put in jail in Pakistan. So he spent the longest years of his life in jail. Anyway, this man is forgotten both in Pakistan and in India, more or less. And Faisal tried to revive this movement, and during this, two Muslims and two Hindus from the Khudai Khidmatgars, the new version of it, went on a Padyatra to Mathura. Faisal and his group, they tried to dialogue with all the priests, and they were very welcomed very much by all the priests in the neighborhood. Finally, at one temple, the priests were they often ate with the priests. They got prasad, and he was in this temple, and it came time for namaz. And he asked the temple priest if he can go outside and do namaz and then come back. And the temple priest said, by that time they'd become friends, because Faisal, by the way, quotes from the Ramayana. He knows the Ramayana very well. He knows Hindu texts as well as the Quran. And so he's always trying to create a kind of dialogue.
Harmonious environment, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he's successful. So the priest told him to pray, to do his namaz inside the mosque, inside in the temple compound. They did that, but they made the mistake of taking photographs and putting them on Facebook. So the moment the photographs of namaz being done by two people within the temple compound went public, the Hindutva went to town, made a WhatsApp, made it viral, and Faisal was arrested. The Hindus in his team were not arrested, but he was arrested, and it took more than a month of battling to get him released. We had to do an international campaign to get Faisal free, because he had broken no law at all. Anyway, so I'm just giving you an example of how dangerous it is to have a Muslim name in India right now.
How do we continue to having those difficult conversations where people are bringing in all of these kind of statements or measures, and yet we want to continue these kind of dialogues to happen within a secular space also? Because a lot of times people are beginning to believe that what a large majority or certain people are saying is the truth, and a lot of that kind of truth is being circulated as well.
It's a old trick that was tried in Nazi Germany, that you repeat a lie 1,000 times and people take it as the truth. So they keep repeating it. They have the means to repeat it because they have all their WhatsApps and all their not just they have the legal media with them, electronic media, the print media, and a large section of the internet media is also with them. So that is those are the stories that you'll keep hearing. But you can, if you want to, do your own research and find the truth. I mean, this claim that 80% people want this and 80% people want that is this manufactured. I mean,
Absolutely, I agree.
Even the elections that they won. They won how many? They won in 2014. They won by 31%. 31% voted for them, and in the next election it was 1 or 2% more than that. But so the majority of the country has voted against them. Yet they are in power. Just like Donald Trump was in power in America, although he didn't have the popular vote, he still became president of America, and he, virtually hijacked the whole American system. But it didn't last, and this in India will not last either. What is happening right now is that there's a partnership between the right-wing forces that believe in this majoritarian idea that we'll teach the Muslims a lesson, we are the Hindus, we're strong and we'll do whatever we want on a cultural front. But there's a partnership between them and big business that gains from the fact that people focus on minor religious issues while they get to do the loot. So you have the Ambanis and Adanis that the whole economy is about, and you have an increasingly number of people who are being dispossessed and thrown even off their own land. And now you're seeing that is not working anymore. That is breaking down. And you see the farmers on the streets. You see, these are contradictions that they cannot paper over forever. Some elite sitting in America or Canada or in India, as elite doesn't realize that this kind of rule is not possible to sustain over a long period of time. People are not so dumb and stupid that they will accept, being robbed every single day.
The film mentions how some of this was a response to the Mandal Commission, and Dalits were not really supportive of the movement. But why do you think that Dalit opposition to a Brahminist party like the BJP has lost momentum in all the anti-Muslim rhetoric?
So I think there's a confusion here. The film certainly doesn't talk about, in fact, shows that the Dalits, whoever I was interviewing, whether they were backward caste, so-called backward caste, or Dalit community, are people who did not support the Ram temple. In fact, the film ends with a Dalit woman who talks about, why should I run after Ram? There's just one Ram. What about all our birthplaces that are being demolished? So that is not the story of Ram Ke Naam. In Ram Ke Naam, there you can see a clear caste divide where the people of the upper caste are the ones pushing the temple, and the people who are not upper caste are not necessarily part of this upsurge. Today, that situation has changed a little bit, because after the Mandal Commission movement, in that period, 1990, there was a fight between Mandal and Kamandal. That means the bow and arrow. So the bow and arrow of Ram, that is Hindutva, and the Mandal Commission, which was the other backward caste fighting for their rights. I'll take you back to when reservation policy began in India. It began, deal was struck in the 1930s that Dalits would get reserved seats. But the other backward castes were not part of that reservation policy or affirmative action policy. The other backward castes finally got recognized in the 90s when the Mandal Commission report began to be implemented. And so that created that for the BJP forces was a warning signal that there would be caste understanding of society. There might be caste unity between Dalits and backward castes, and so this would become a huge mass force. They had to then organize, especially amongst the OBCs, the other backward castes, and they successfully did that. Actually, today the large backbone of the Hindutva forces comes from the OBC, the other backward castes. To some extent, even some Dalits. I mean, they made a Dalit president of India as a Dalit. So they have bought over leadership from the Dalit community as well, but they've not been able to fool the Dalits en masse. But they have managed to make deep inroads within the other backward castes. Modi also comes from the OBC community, or at least claims to. So anyway, so it's a very complicated system. I would characterize the Hindutva forces as mainly a Brahminical force. Right from the beginning, 100 years ago, the RSS, the Hindu Mahasabha, they were Brahminical bodies. But over the years, the RSS has been very dynamic, and they have been trying to grow. And they have, as I said, now they have other castes that are part of that system. Although I don't believe that they ever allow intercaste marriage within their system. And you might get a few examples of even Hindu-Muslim marriages within the BJP fold, but you'll hardly ever get examples of intercaste marriage where upper caste Hindus are married in Dalits. So, in fact, I believe that the real way to end the caste system and even end religious hatred is for intercaste marriage and interreligious marriages. I mean, if we had, the opposite of, what they have made this big issue of love jihad, as you know. So the reason that they made a big issue of love jihad is this is a terrorizing thing for them. That if what would happen to religious identity and caste identity and all that if everybody's blood gets mixed up. So I think our ideal is that everybody's blood should be mixed up so that people live as human beings and they forget about what is your cultural past.
Please go ahead and ask your question.
So I was just curious to know that because of the current fundraising which is going on for the Ram Mandir, do you anticipate further trouble in the communities? And if there's going to be a young man or a woman who, inspired by Anand Patwardhan, goes and makes a documentary in today's day?
I'm sure there are hundreds of young people who are making documentaries. I don't know exactly all over the country, because documentary filmmaking is now much more accessible to people than in the days that I started out, because there you needed 16 millimeter equipment and stuff like that. Now people can shoot on their phones, and people are doing it all the time. I mean, the whole farmers movement that is going on in our country comes to us mainly through people's phones. Because the mainstream media is reporting very little of it, and so I think it's harder now to hide because everybody has a cell phone. So I think that as far as the Muslim community is concerned, I don't think that there are many Muslims who want to continue the fight about Babri Masjid. They're saying now it's done. We don't want to lose a single more life on that issue. So let's move forward. And I think that's fair enough for Muslims to say, because it is terrorizing for them to start any kind of fight about it. But I think it is not right for secular Indians from all communities to accept this theft of property and theft of culture as a given, because the Supreme Court had a ruling. I think the Supreme Court ruling on this was completely bad in law. The High Court ruling before that was bad in law, and it doesn't bode well for our future that we allow such things to happen without questioning them. Our entire constitution is being subverted every day, and we have to keep fighting for that. So it has, but it has to be a joint fight. It cannot be that the Muslims fight for what is perceived as a Muslim issue and we non-Muslims fight for something else. It has to be a joint struggle, and it has been that. I mean, even when they tried to pass when they passed the Citizenship Amendment Act last year, almost now a year and a half ago, there were huge demonstrations all over the country. Started, of course, in Delhi by Muslim women who sat on the street in Shaheen Bagh. But those Shaheen Baghs spread to different parts of the country, and they were not occupied only by Muslims. There were people from different communities who came to show their solidarity, that they agreed that that this is not the India we want, where some community is called a second-class citizen. Everybody is equal in this society, should be equal, and so I think that those fights are going on. Things are dangerous when you resist the government because this is a vindictive government.
I have many questions for you, so I'm just going to pick up one at random. Could you reflect a little bit on how do you choose what to make films about, and what are you working on next?
Okay, so I say this often. I don't actually look for films to make. I'm pretty happy not making a film, and very often if you see that I finish a film and then it takes me years to get started on something else. It's not that I churn them out every 1 year or 2 years. In fact, the films themselves take a long time. My film before Reason was BHIM COMRADE, and it took 14 years to make. And then after we completed it in 2011, up to 2018, I was hadn't made a film, but I was shooting. And then finally in 2018, Reason or Vivek was made public. And now since then, I haven't made another film. But you know, I'm basically working on home movies. It's been a period of lockdown, so I haven't gone out very much. But I've been filming. I've been editing footage that I shot with my parents and family stuff over the years. So it's which is basically a home movie, but it has political elements because my family happened to be part of the freedom movement. So there are a lot of stories there. The Hindu majority forces right now have made a big issue of what they call love jihad. Well, in America, they use, I thought by now everyone knows jihad, because that is what they claim that the Muslim fundamentalists are using, the concept of a holy war. That jihad allows people, Muslims, to die for their religion because it's a holy war. That's what God has said that they should do. By the way, every religion has their own concept of a holy war. So in Islam, it's maybe called jihad. In Hinduism, it's called dharm yudh, religious war. In Christianity, it's holy war. I mean, the Crusades were about that. So people going to war because they think the God has told them that we have to defeat the infidels or the people on the other side who belong to another faith. Even if you look at the people who are religious, they follow very different texts. So in every religion, there are different texts that are being followed. So there's no single word of God that everybody knows. I mean, in Islam, they claim that the Quran has never been rewritten and stuff like that. But even that was a part of the oral tradition. After all, it took hundreds of years before things got written down. And so in those hundreds of years, even if there was a God who came on earth to tell the story to somebody who would then write it down hundreds of years later, their followers would write it down. You can imagine that those things changed over time. So I personally believe that man created God and not that God created man. But that is, I'm not getting into that. I don't insist that everybody else believes that.
Can you please talk about the possible reasons why and how counter-narrative to this extremism and religious fundamentalism has failed both in India and Pakistan?
Well, there are international forces in both. In the creation of religious fundamentalism, there has always been an international beneficiary. So in pre-partition India, before independence, the beneficiary were clearly the British, who, as I said, was sowing disharmony, communal hatred within this land that they were ruling with a very few number of British people to actually control this huge territory. They could only do that by keeping people fighting amongst each other. So they did that during the colonial era, but they continued to do that even after the colonial era. In fact, they ensured that there would be a partition in India because it would become still, they were afraid that a strong India, which included Pakistan and Bangladesh and all the territories that then got split up, a strong India would have been a threat to the West. It would have been a threat. It wouldn't have been possible to loot the resources in the same way. So for them, it was better to have these different countries, preferably fighting each other, whom we could arm, because the whole international economy is also controlled by the arms trade. So the biggest weapons manufacturers would be at a loss if there were no wars to be created. And creating a territory in India and Pakistan and China and etc., which are at war with each other, helps the international arms trade, the countries that are selling weapons to both sides. So that is part of it. There is economic forces that want the tension to continue in India and Pakistan. That's the international part of it. But also the national part of it is that both India and Pakistan are ruled by tiny elites. And that those tiny elites also cannot stay in power if people wake up to their own actual interests. Right now, we see in India people waking up to their own actual interests in the form of the farmers. Last year, we saw the people, the Muslim community, parts of the Muslim community protesting against Citizenship Amendment Act. And 2 years before that, we saw, in 2016, we saw students who started the revolt because the neoliberal forces were cutting back education, cutting back on funding of public education. So the main places that were government funded educational institutions were the places where student revolts were taking place, because they were facing cutbacks. They were facing, destruction of public education. So you had the incident of Rohit Vemula, who committed suicide in Hyderabad University, and that cause was taken up by students all over the country, and it became a mass movement. So over the last few years, you've seen different spots of resistance. That fight is not going to come from people who are well off, who are comfortable, whose share market is rising. That's the other irony, that even as the actual economic situation deteriorates for the masses, the share market is in the opposite direction. So the elite is kept happy. And what we hear from who creates the news, who tells these stories and spreads these messages is largely the elite. How do people get their information these days, even from the internet? Supposing you don't believe the television and you don't believe the newspapers, then you go to the net. You type something in Google, you get Wikipedia. Now, even Wikipedia, the right-wing forces are changing it every minute. And then you have, if you look at search engine, the thing you get most is Quora. And Quora is an RSS run body. Now, the people don't necessarily know that. So you're getting this RSS information, thinking that you're innocently getting the truth from the internet. And a lot of people are completely fooled by such things.
When the Ram Janmabhoomi Sthabhana was taking place, I have been speaking to people in Canada and my relatives in India. And I don't believe we have that movement that you want to actually resist this. I mean, I am thinking of Modi as fascist, but most people that I know don't agree with me. But I don't see the will to resist such a movement. And I'm afraid that we are going to be soon a Hindu state. Can you correct me? We are not getting the right spin. We are not getting the right spin on all this. So I want you to put a positive spin and say, yes, we are going to remain a secular state.
We are not going to remain a secular state unless we fight for it. There's no doubt about the fact that the people in power come from, I'm not saying that we have fascism actually in power. It's not reached the stage of full-blown fascism as happened in Nazi Germany, where they had open extermination camps and things like that. But we are headed in that direction. And people, it's the duty of everyone who understands this to speak up and speak up now, because the more we wait, the more it'll be too late. But at the same time, I'm not pessimist. I don't believe that fascism is sustainable. I don't believe in India it will succeed, especially because, I think even Amartya Sen talks about this in the argumentative Indian. You can't put three Indians in the same place and they'll agree with each other for a long period of time. So I think that this fascist idea of one leader, one guy who will tell you everything and you swallow it, is likely to succeed in the long run. It's not sustainable. And even Hitler didn't last for very long. So fascism is not sustainable. That should give us hope that we have to wait it out. We have to survive this period, but not just survive. We have to actively resist, and that people are doing that. People are doing that very bravely all over the country. So I think if you want to get inspired, there's much to be inspired by.
Mm-hmm. Shri, could you ask your question?
Hi, Shri.
So I really want you to talk a little bit about what the farmers' movement has been, its roots, and how that actually is beginning to consolidate, the forces that you're talking about. So I feel that there isn't as much information that people have here that they should have in order to fully understand what's going on in this particular context.
Okay, so one thing is that there is a difference between the Shaheen Bagh movement, or the movement against the Citizenship Amendment Act, which became widespread, because the government could target that as something done by Muslims, that Muslims were the people who were causing trouble, and nobody else cared about the issue. That wasn't true. I mean, there were many people. I went to a rally in December 2019 in Mumbai, and we had almost 1.5 lakh people, more people than I had ever seen in recent times. And they were Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, everybody was there protesting against the Citizenship Amendment Act. And all this movement got derailed because of COVID, because of the lockdown. And they were able to shut it down in the name of COVID. And also they created a riot in Delhi. After the riot had happened, they pretended as if this was a riot started by Muslims, but actually the opposite was true, because most of the victims were Muslims. And this was a riot that was very much, I believe, to be sponsored by the government and the police to crush the Citizenship Amendment movement. But the difference between that and what is happening today with the farmers is that while you can demonize the Muslims, it's very hard to demonize the farmers, because the farmers are spread all over the country. It's not just Punjab and Haryana right now that are fighting. They are right now at the forefront of the fight. But yesterday I went in Mumbai. I'm in Mumbai right now. So where we have a rally going on of the farmers who have gathered at Azad Maidan. And I'll be going back later today. And it's also a huge rally that people have walked from their hometowns to come to Mumbai to show their solidarity with the farmer struggle. So this is something I don't think the government can easily wish away. In fact, they themselves have been trying to compromise. They even offered them a moratorium of 1.5 years. They said, okay, we'll take back these farmers' laws. I don't know if, by the way, I should probably explain to you what is going on at the heart of the matter here. The government is trying to implement neoliberal policies which on the farms, which basically means taking all power of decision away from the farmers themselves and handing them over to big business, mainly Adani and Ambani in India, but corporate business in the world, corporate agro business in the world. So eventually, this is like re-inviting the East India Company to take over our economy, surrendering our national sovereignty, even our land, because eventually the farmers who cannot pay for heavy fertilizer, seeds, and the chemical farming will get into debt, and then their lands will be usurped by big corporations. So our whole farming will be done by corporates. And that is the intention of the government, to surrender the farming to corporates. That means encouraging GMOs, modified food, modified farming methods, etc., which are in long term destructive. And so, luckily, not luckily, but I would say naturally, the people who are most affected, that are the farmers, know what's going on. You can't fool them. And so they have taken a stand. They didn't agree to the proposal of the government of 1.5 years of moratorium. They said repeal the laws, and they're standing firm. And tomorrow they're going to be taking out a tractor rally, which will be historical in the world. It will be the largest tractor rally ever. So I think the government is basically has been caught in a situation where they're trying to save face, but it's very difficult because they probably have made the deal with the corporate class already. So they can't back down from these farm laws on the one hand, because they've actually probably already accepted the money for the deal. And they cannot repeal the laws. But the farmers are saying, we're not budging until you repeal the laws. So it's a standoff.
There's a question that might also, you can probably elaborate on, that the mainstream media in India are wing media, now dubbed Modi media. And the social media pages are overrun by paid troll armies of BJP, RSS. Well, how would you actually react to that? Because there's a Modi media which has absolutely taken such a huge space also, and people are listening to this constantly within that.
Yeah, I mean, they listen to Man Ki Baat, but I'm pretty confident that the Man Ki Baat is so boring that it's very hard for people to listen to the same thing, the same tune, the same tone every day. Modi has a great skill, and that is a skill of a Nautanki artist. He's a performer, and he performs very well. And yeah, so you can get enthralled by that performance for a little while, but when that same performance comes again and again and again, I think people will get tired of it. People I know are already tired of it a long time ago. And the people that I meet on the street who are working class people, the rickshawala, the taxi wala, my conversations with them show that this popularity is something that is, manufactured. Just like Trump told everyone that he's winning the election, Modi tells everyone that they have 80% majority, but actually that's not the case. It's actually a very hollow claim, and unfortunately, our elections are manipulated. Our elections are manipulated in different ways. I'm not talking about straightforward EVM vote machine manipulation, which is being done, I believe. But apart from that, the elections are based on money power, and the BJP is the only party that has money today. They have huge, overwhelming resources, and they get their money, by the way, from abroad as well, from the diaspora as well. But they get lots of their money from the corporate class, and they have created rules that have destroyed all transparency. Like after COVID happened, the coronavirus epidemic happened, they immediately created a PM Cares Fund. It's called Prime Minister Cares Fund, which is meant to fight COVID. But they made sure that PM Cares Fund has no transparency at all. Nobody has the right to know who gave the money or how the money was spent. So they have resisted every attempt to bring it under the RTI, which is the Right to Information Act. And so we are not told where this money is coming from or who it's going to. What have they done? So that is how the system is operating now. I say that it's unsustainable, and that is where the hope lies.
All right, I'm going to ask M.V. Raman, who has had his hand up for some time. So if you could like to speak and ask your question.
Hi, Ramana.
Anand, how are you?
Good.
Yeah. Question for you. I'm thinking about the connection between what's happening on the economic front and the support for the BJP. So if you think about when the masjid was destroyed in 1992, and so the earlier period before that was just the beginning of the economic liberalization era, right? Or sort of the predating of that. And now what we've seen the last 20 odd years has been sort of the the opening up of the sector in so many ways and the kind of growth of crony capitalism, which is now obvious to many people. And in a way, in other countries like in the United States, you're seeing a little bit of a backlash. Right? That's part of what explains Trump's support among certain sections of the people, at least his appeal to certain sections of the people. Of course, he cheated them. That's a different issue. Right? So the question is, how do you see the relationship between what's happening in terms of economic policies and the material reality, in some sense, what most people are going to be living, and the kind of ideological attraction that Hindutva might afford to at least the Hindu majority in the country?
Okay, if we go back in time, and you're talking about the dawn of the liberalization era, which would be in the 80s and 90s, you see that it coincides with the rise of religious fundamentalism. So that can't be an accident. It can't be an accident that the very period when liberalization is growing in India and the idea of mixed economy is being undermined. The idea, when India became independent, it was, a partnership between private enterprise and public enterprise, and there was emphasis on public institutions. And when that is replaced by a far more liberalized idea of the economy, the idea of socialism also, by the time this is also coincides with the collapse of the Soviet Union in that same period, where America finally wins the Cold War and the Soviet Union is dissolved. So the negative aspect of that, I mean, people celebrated the coming down of the Berlin Wall, and even I celebrated the coming down of the Berlin Wall, but it didn't lead to what Gorbachev wanted, the kind of, it temporarily, there was a, nuclear disarmament and to some extent, cooling down of the war hysteria, but America did not honor their part of that agreement, and they continued into outer space. They continued their nuclear development, etc., into outer space, and they escalated. Ronald Reagan's time, they actually completely destroyed the spirit of the agreement reached between Gorbachev and Reagan for a kind of détente. And basically the complete routing of the Soviet Union meant it became as if the idea of socialism or socialist ideas themselves were denigrated. I mean, in America and Canada, I think socialism is seen as a bad word. It's like communist is even worse, but socialist itself is bad, and even liberal is bad because the country had moved so far, the thinking had moved so far to the right. And you see that is the period where internationally religious ideas and identity ideas are rising. So in Yugoslavia, you have the Yugoslavian experiment collapse. Tito was actually in the middle fighting the worst kind of Stalinism, but still in that camp. But they had at least solved their internal battles of identity, but all that disintegrated into wars like the Bosnia and the massacre of Muslims in that part of the world. So you see everywhere in the world this religious specter rising at the same time, hand in hand with the rise of neoliberalism. And you ask yourself, why is that? If money is God, then why do you need the original gods, the religious gods as well? So, but the religious gods and the money gods went hand in hand. And that is something that needs to be understood.
I'm going to ask Jake Joseph and then Saleha Athar and then Radhika to also ask their questions.
Can you speak to not just this, but the wider issue of media in India having to muzzle itself because there is this whole Modi, the Modi toadies doing their business, essentially threatening people and so forth.
And you haven't watched my films, it looks like. And so that I would recommend that you do that when you get a chance. But because I talk about everything that you talked about. And I would tell you that what has happened to Tanda, it couldn't happen to me because even the OTT platforms were scared to show my films. Unlike with Tandav, they actually put it on Netflix, and Netflix has, so I think that I'm a bit jealous of those who are on Netflix and then get into trouble, because I'm not even able to get on Netflix because they're too scared to touch the films, because they know in advance that there will be trouble when they show this. So in that sense, especially documentaries face greater hardship than some kinds of fiction do, because fiction still is made, you can get them onto OTT platforms to some extent. But you're right that there are troll armies, and they've attacked not just Tandav, but they even attacked, by the way, Meera Nair's Suitable Boy, because there was a scene,
Really?
a romance between a Hindu and a Muslim that they couldn't tolerate. And yeah, because they call this, we were discussing this earlier, they call it love jihad. That is, they claim that Muslims are using entrapment of Hindu girls in order to grab the Hindu girls. The old mythology, like white people used to say the black people are going to, sleep with all our women. So they were lynched because the women were the property that the underprivileged are going to grab. And so this is that kind of mythology that exists in India, in the Hindu majoritarian mindset, that these are terrible forces and they're after our women.
I'm going to ask Saleha, who's been waiting to ask her question, please.
Pakistan and India's conscious people, writers, poets, progressive and socialist people try to make the friendship in between the two countries.
Yeah.
But it was not fulfilled this. The question is that it is possible to create friendship in between the disturbed political and religious countries?
Absolutely possible, and we have been actually doing it for many, many years now. I'm part of a movement that began in the late 90s called the Pakistan-India Forum for Peace and Democracy. And we tried to exchange visits between India and Pakistan. So one year the Indians would go to Pakistan. In those years, this was when there's a Cold War between India and Pakistan going on, so it was always hard to get visas. But we managed to get visas for large groups of people, like 200 at a time. And I've been to Pakistan 5-6 times with the delegation of citizens, not the government, people who believe in peace. And there are people who believe in peace on both sides of the border. And we have exchanged visits over the years. In recent years, that had got stopped. So in recent years, ever since the Modi regime came to power, it's become much more difficult to exchange visits from India to Pakistan. So that has gone on it's been a greater struggle, but the movements on both sides of the border still exist. And we will keep fighting for that. Because basically we are the same people. We are the same people divided by, not even divided by culture that much. Even the culture was syncretic. There were so many things in common, language in common, even religious. Sometimes even the religious rituals are very similar because they learn from each other.
Asfar Adip, please ask your question.
Thanks so much, and it's a pleasure and privilege to be able to interact with you. So my question is, there have been so many institutions and people in India who have guided the entire world through culturalism, secularism, and humanity. For instance, we can talk about Rabindranath Tagore, the institution he built, Shantiniketan Vishwabharati. But now, because of this rise of the right-wing nationalism, we are seeing that even these institutions are getting colorized. Like BJP is getting more influence in the West Bengal, and so they're actually infecting all of these. So how's your judgment about this scenario? Thank you.
Yeah. So you're right. The thing is that, you know, the Hindutva forces or the majoritarian forces have nothing to show in terms of their history of fight against colonialism. They were not the fighters against colonialism. None of their people went to jail against the British, except for one guy called Savarkar, and he issued 5 mercy petitions to get out of the Andamans where he was put, and he swore that he would never fight the British once he was released. He was released. He never spoke against the British again, but he became part of the main plot to kill Mahatma Gandhi. So what I'm saying is that the because the right wing forces have no historical figures to talk about of their own, they keep on appropriating other freedom fighters and claiming that this person represented our ideas. But that absolutely is untrue. Right now they're claiming Subhash Chandra Bose, but Subhash Chandra Bose was never a communal person, never spoke. I mean, his Indian National Army was full of different religions, and they swore allegiance only to independence and not to religion. So um, yeah, so but that process of appropriation is an ongoing one. So now they're trying to appropriate even Tagore, when Tagore was not even spoke against. Tagore even differed with Mahatma Gandhi on the issue of nationalism, because Tagore was an internationalist. He said that nationalism is a very narrow ideal, and so um, I think that this appropriation of Shantiniketan and attempted appropriation, it's, you know, it's patently absurd, but that doesn't mean they won't get away with it in the short run, because they control the instruments of propaganda.
I'm going to ask Radhika Desai to ask a question.
Thanks very much. I wasn't going to ask this, Anand, but since you brought up the Berlin Wall coming down, I have to ask you this. So you rightly corrected us that you made the film Ram Ki Naam in 1990, and that was the first attempt on the Babri Masjid. And then, of course, in 1992, they succeeded. And I want to put this in an international context, because just the previous year, in 1989, the entire world had watched the Berlin Wall being brought down with just handheld instruments by people in Berlin. And this was seen as a great sort of, how can you say, celebration of people's power. And I wonder if they hadn't choreographed both the planned initial and the eventual successful assault on the Babri Masjid, bearing that in mind, somehow imitating this, and somehow how the feelings of the ordinary people had overcome them and they had brought down this structure, etc. So if you could comment on that, that would be great.
Well, actually, there's a lot of mythology involved, and there's a lot of hidden stories behind the demolition of the Babri Mosque. One of those hidden stories was done by Cobra Post a few years ago. Cobra Post is an organization that has used hidden cameras to do interviews with people that often are startling. So they had interviewed many of the people accused of the demolition of the mosque and who were on trial. They'd used hidden cameras to show that actually the BJP forces got their own car sevaks, their own faithful followers, to get killed in police firings in the earlier assault on the mosque in 1990, where about 29 car sevaks were killed by the police. That was actually revealed on hidden camera as something that they had deliberately engineered, that they would have their own followers get killed so that then they would make them into martyrs, take their ashes all over the country, and build up this movement for the demolition of the mosque. So, but these are stories that have come out on the internet, but has a limited life. You can still find it on the internet, but not a lot of people are watching those kind of stories. So then the prevailing story is what they manufacture. So if you're asking whether they were inspired by the demolition of the Berlin Wall, possibly they possibly had that, but they had made these plans already. And by the way, while we are told that the Babri Mosque was demolished by bare hands. Actually, in my opinion, because I was there in 1990 when they made the first assault, it was a very strong structure that couldn't be brought down in a short while by bare hands and a few pickaxes. And many people have alleged that they actually used bombs in the middle to detonate the demolition. So anyway, that apart is neither here nor there. They claimed that it was a mass action, and the court, which is now their court, has ruled that nobody was guilty. At least they couldn't find that this was the work of antisocial elements who were unidentified. But actually, they were all on camera. They were all on camera, and then they were later on hidden camera where they spoke and talked about how and why they did the demolition. So actually, the stories we're being told are completely false. And the evidence shows that the opposite was true, that it was a pre-planned assault.
I want to thank Aisha Memuri and Ishita Tiwari, who were moderating the questions also and helping me sieve through them. I also want to mention Stephen McLean Rogers, who's been helpful with all the technical know-how and the technical details for this entire session. And thank you, Radhika Desai. And I'm going to invite Zahid Maktoum to say the last words and closing remarks for the day. I thank each and every one.
Hi, thank you first and foremost, Brother Anand. Grateful to you for a remarkable and insightful reflection and a compendium of reflections of yours. I simply would like to just take this away from this event, that we have a greater need for solidarity amongst ourselves. We need to organize. We need to do what Indian farmers are doing. I mean, they're very peaceful, very organized, very connected, and they are able to reach out, and they are able to actually capture imagination of people all over the world. And in the end, I'll just take a few lines from Brother Anand's movie. Actually, these are lines from Kabir, a poet that represent the secular, syncretic, pluralistic character of India, which is being subverted today. So this is what Kabir says: Saints, I see, the world is mad. If I tell the truth, they rush to beat me. If I lie, they trust me. Hindus claim Ram as the one, Muslim claims Rahim. They kill each other, knowing not the essence, with prayer beads and caps and brows of holy paint. They lose themselves in sacred hymns, but know not their own souls. Many holy men I have seen, teachers of holy books, who acquire disciples, venerate graves, but know not God. The world goes on like this, and they call me mad. But Kabir says, listen, who's the one insane? So thank you, Anandji, for your insights and for your teaching, for your commitment, for your beauty, for your kindness, for your generosity. We are very grateful to you.
So I just want to leave with one thought, that because I'm not sure if this is reported in North America enough, but the farmers who are fighting right now have been in the bitter cold in Delhi for the last few months, and more than 100 farmers have lost their lives in these protests, just fighting it out against the elements and against a state that does not wish to compromise. So we are in a battle for life and death.
Would you like to actually then leave a comment or a suggestion for the diaspora? What can they do and how can they actually add to whatever is happening?
No, I think that firstly they have to inform themselves of what is happening, what are the issues involved that the farmers are fighting for, because I think these are international issues. Basically, agribusiness all over the world is trying to take over all resources, and so this is part of that game, and everyone in every part of the country, world, needs to learn from what is happening in India. This is heroic resistance, which is very critical for the planet. Because if the planet falls into the hands of agro-business alone and business alone, then the kind of food growth that we'll see, the kind of resources will actually destroy the planet, because that is where we're headed. So we are in a battle which is much larger than a battle for India.
And I'm hoping as India marks its 71st, Independence Day, day after tomorrow, and tomorrow for you, Anand, I'm reminded of Tagore's poem that where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country awake. May we continue to uphold our constitution, and may we keep upholding our secular ideologies and secular thoughts. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Anand.
Bye-bye.